It's Mo. It is April 13th, and I have read 6 books in April so far, so it is well past time to talk about my April monthly reading wrap-up. I do these reading wrap-ups vlog style, and I try to talk about each book that I read as close to when I read them as I can. Obviously, sometimes I fail in that task spectacularly, but I try to talk about whether I like the book, what I thought of it, what it's about, if I think you would like it, or if I recommend it, and I try to talk for only about 5 minutes. That being said, my wrap-ups are still quite long. So I have to pull up my Goodreads so that I can accurately tell you what books I read when. The first book that I finished in April is A Scandal in Brooklyn by Lauren Wilkinson. This is a short story that I got free with one of my subscriptions. I read a Lauren Wilkinson book earlier this year, American Spy, so I was excited to see A Scandal in Brooklyn pop up so that I could have another chance to read her writing. A Scandal in Brooklyn is a take on the A Scandal in Bohemia Sherlock Holmes story, and it follows Irene Adler and a friend of hers when she calls him to help her investigate a missing person. That missing person case definitely turns into more when they go to a secret Brooklyn facility run by a millionaire tech mogul who happens to be Irene Adler's ex-husband. So this is definitely a modern take on the Sherlock Holmes style story, and as many women have picked up on Irene Adler's prowess as a detective, it follows her instead of Holmes. Our main character is a young queer man who knew Irene and who is a reporter, so she thinks will be able to help her, even though she's like a Sherlock Holmes type person, so she basically knows everything that's going on. And then throw in that little like futuristic tech, closed door, isolated, weird laboratory factory / science experiment element, and you have a very modern idea of the old Sherlock Holmes mysteries. This short story was not great. It was definitely not my favorite. I think that it was a very rudimentary and amateurish attempt at retelling of Sherlock Holmes. I've read several retellings of Sherlock Holmes or reimaginings inspired by kind of tales, and I just feel like this one didn't have any real new exciting take on it or interesting ideas to take away from it. I've definitely seen people do Irene Adler stories versus Sherlock Holmes stories. I liked that the main character was queer and that there was a queer character within the story, but otherwise it was just okay. And since I felt similarly about Lauren Wilkinson's other book, I think that I probably won't be trying any more of her work, at least for a while. I didn't hate either of them. I think that she has a very basic, rudimentary, plain writing style that's definitely not offensive in any way, but also not compelling in any way. The next book that I read in April was The Interior Landscape, Classical Tamil Poems by A.K. Ramanujan. This is a older work of poetry. It's an NYRB book of poetry that was originally published in 1967 and then republished for NYRB. And that's kind of NYRB's thing, is to publish work that is like forgotten or has gone out of print, gone out of style, and kind of bring them back to the spotlight. This was a really interesting collection of classical ancient Tamil poems from India, and it had a foreword and an afterwards which were incredibly interesting and definitely worth reading for sure. I would say you could read them in any order. You could read the poems first and then read it like I did, or you can read the foreword and the afterword and then read the poems. But the whole idea is that these poems were reimagined slightly and translated by A.K. Ramanujan, and he took these classical ancient poems, which are attributed to poets, but often they are like folk tales or folk songs, kind of of interspersed, like we're not sure if that's exactly the place that they came from. The poems themselves are love poems and tell a story, well, love and not love, that tell a story of a couple who the man is higher in class than the woman, but they fall in love and he promises that he will marry her, but their love is a little bit star-crossed and hard to maintain. He ends up leaving and going on adventures, maybe to battle or to seek his fortune, and then it's about his feelings, their feelings of love in the beginning, their feelings of separation, their feelings of potential betrayal, has he found another lover, and then they're reuniting at kind of the end of these stories. And it's told from our two lovers as well as their friends, their parents and mother-in-laws and guardians, all in very short poems that often have a lot to do with nature and the natural surroundings of the poems. And when you read the back, it's so interesting because Tamil poetry was organized in a way that the different emotions and the different genders and the different ideas were organized with different trees, different seasons, different landscapes. There's really another added layer under these poems besides them just being interesting poems that sometimes when you read the language might be confusing, but once you realize that every natural aspect of the poems have significance just as much as the lovers' stories do, it's really, really fascinating. So this is my first NYRB poetry book, and I definitely plan on getting more. They're really short and concise, and they have a lot of interesting collections, so I'm excited about that one. And this was the first poetry collection that I read for National Poetry Month. The next book that I finished in April was Felix Ever After by Kaysen Callender, and this is a YA book about Felix. It follows Felix and his best friend as they navigate normal high school things at their art high school in New York. It has all the modern things that teenagers go through, crushes and unrequited love, sex and drugs and alcohol and studies and trying to get your portfolio ready for college, trying to get into the college you want, not really knowing what college you want, or maybe you want a college because it's prestigious, but you don't really necessarily want to go there. Felix is dealing with all these very normal teenage things in his summer classes, but unfortunately, he's also dealing with someone outing him in public in the school for being trans and amplifying his dead name, hacking into his phone and telling all the students his history that he doesn't necessarily want known because it's private. Felix doesn't worry about people knowing that he's trans. He's always talked about that and he's never hid it, but having been dead named and having his privacy invaded is really hard on him. He's also wondering about his identity. He feels confident in having come out as trans, but now he's wondering if maybe he's a little bit more gender fluid than just a trans man. So this book was really good. It's such a great book to have for so many people and something that I didn't have when I was younger. I don't battle with my sexuality or my gender, but it would have been a great thing to know back when I was a teenager that people were dealing with this, because maybe I would have been more aware of people who were dealing with these types of topics around me. I really liked that it was set in New York and set in Brooklyn, and so there were definitely some landscape items and stuff that I noticed, which was cool, and I liked that at its heart it was a good-hearted book. Like, this one person does a bad thing to Felix, and it really sets in the realization for him that lots of bad things happen to especially queer and transgender people, but he has this great friend group around him. He has a collection of people who have crushes on him. He has people who are watching out for him. He has a great relationship with his father, even though he doesn't with his mother. So there's just a really wonderful, like, balance in this book, I think. And I think within that balance, there are also all the YA tropes that, like, are the reason that I don't like YA. It's super angsty. He and his friends have this insecurity that's obvious but also this kind of boistering security of thinking that they know everything. You know, there's a point where Felix can't decide if he wants to take revenge on this person, and he kind of jumps to conclusions, of course, about who the person who outed him is and what he's going to do to take revenge, which obviously he's proved that he shouldn't take revenge, that there are other avenues that you should do, and there's other things and other ways to show people that they've done the wrong thing and that they've made the wrong decision than like doing what they did to you. So it did exactly what it was supposed to do, and I think young people can identify with this and old people can identify with it from their past, but it definitely was YA. So it did drag a little bit for me, and it definitely did feel very YA to me. So I read that for the Trans Girl April readathon, and I'm so happy that I did. It was also on my 20 books I found out about in 2020 that I wanted to read in 2021, and now I've finally read it in 2023. The next book that I read in April is The Axeman by Ray Celestine. I have wanted to read this book since I heard about it. It is a historical fiction set in 1919 revolving around the 1918 to 1919 murders by the Axeman, who was a real-life serial killer working in New Orleans in those years. This book is also called The Axeman's Jazz, and Ray Celestine is a British author, or he lives in Britain, and he writes other books, other historical fiction books set in America, and The Axeman actually has 3 sequels. This is a series following some of the same characters from this book as they travel to different American cities, and all focus on real life events and all have real life people involved in them. The Axeman is the first in the series. It takes place in New Orleans, and we are following a very large cast of characters. There is Ida Davis, who is working for the Pinkerton Agency, which was a true real-life agency of detectives that were kind of freelance detectives. You could hire them in lieu of the police. They were bounty hunters, or you could hire them to investigate your issues that you were having or investigate crime. And a lot of times they cooperated with law enforcement as well. The Pinkertons were known for hiring women at a time when that was really not done. So Ida tries to get a job with them to be a detective, but she ends up basically just being a secretary. Ida is not only a young woman, she's only about 20 years old, but she is also black. She's very light-skinned and she can pass for white, but it has hindered her getting jobs, and in a very racially segregated town like New Orleans, it is often a detriment to the things that she wants to do. She knows that the only way that she is going to prove herself to her boss at the Pinkerton Agency, it's only her and him there anyway, and move on to be a detective, is to solve a big case, and she is taking on the biggest case of recent years by trying to solve the Axeman murders. We're also following a reporter who has some knowledge of the Axeman, so we're trying to figure out what that is. We're following a police detective who has kind of been shunned from the force because he outed his former boss by letting the police department know that his boss Luca was working for the Italian mafia in New Orleans. We also follow Luca as he is surprised to get out of jail a little bit early, but not surprised that his mafia buddies pulled some strings and now want him to investigate the Axeman case. Those are the main players that we're dealing with. We also get chapters that follow other people. There was a kind of heavy in the police force that Luca used to enforce his rules. There's a young new officer fresh off the boat from Ireland that Michael, the detective, befriends and brings onto the case. And Ida has a friend who is helping her as well. The chapters are fairly short, and they mostly deal with one person: Ida, Michael, Luca, or John. They're all separately investigating the Axeman murders. They're definitely crossing paths. They're definitely impacting each other as well, whether they know it or not. The Axeman is a pretty typical mystery. I would say, you know, you have a murder, you're finding clues, you're doing the things. The only thing that I think really sets it apart is that it is a historical fiction based on real events. I do think that it doesn't really do a good job at being a historical fiction. It feels very, very modern, and you could definitely have this story and these people and the dialogue in basically any time period if you wanted to. There are certain things like how racially segregated New Orleans are, so there are some times when people go into an area that maybe they shouldn't be in, or they're dealing with people not talking to them because of their race, be that Italian, Irish, Black, etc. So there are little things like that, and certainly they don't have cell phones or cars to get around very often. They're taking the train, you know, they're all dealing with paperwork and paper trails rather than digital things. But other than that, it didn't really feel that much like a historical fiction, and I think it didn't feel overly like a New Orleans fiction either. I love books about New Orleans. I love New Orleans, and I like my books to make me feel like I'm in New Orleans, and this felt like it mostly could have been just about any city. There weren't a ton of aspects of this that made me really feel the presence of the city. And maybe that makes sense because Ray Celestine is not from New Orleans. I definitely think it was way, way too long. This is like 450 pages, and it could have been cut down certainly by 100 pages, but maybe even by 200 pages. I liked it okay. I thought it was fine. Not a new favorite. The next book that I read in April was Clumsy by Jeffrey Brown. This is a graphic memoir telling the tale of one of Jeffrey Brown's girlfriends and how they met, how they kind of fell in love and became like quite obsessive about each other, and eventually how that obsession was too much for both of them and they ended up breaking up. I like Jeffrey Brown's art and writing, and this one was definitely one of his early works, so it was very rudimentary, very simple artwork, very quick, sloppy artwork, which is not my favorite of his, but I don't mind it. This graphic memoir did an interesting kind of time jump where the scenes of his relationship were kind of all scattered and non-linear, so you didn't see necessarily their relationship progress minute for minute, but you got glimpses of the good times and the bad times and of the outer influences on their relationship and things like that. I thought it was a little much, honestly. Like, it's not super long, probably like 200 pages. I read this at my friend's house while I was visiting Brooklyn, so I stayed the night and I just read it while I was there. And it's very easy to read, quick, short. It was so much about them having sex and being young people and sex being so important, and so many sex scenes of them having sex at their parents' house, or them having sex, you know, at their friend's house, or them having sex when they came together, and it just was a lot. It definitely gave me the implication that their relationship was very much based on sex, and that was a huge part of the reason that they got together and broke up. And so it didn't really give you a lot of insight into what they were thinking or feeling, and obviously it was all written from one person's perspective, and also it was a relationship that he had when he was quite young, so it makes sense that the focus of the relationship and of the book would be on that subject. It wasn't like my favorite graphic memoir by any means. It wasn't even my favorite Jeffrey Brown book. It was fine. The sixth book that I read in April so far is A Year Without a Name by Cyrus Grace Dunham. This is a memoir about Dunham's time coming to terms with their gender nonconformity, and specifically a time when they were visiting India and fell in love with a girl, and from that point to, I'm guessing, about a year later, when they finally have gender affirming surgery, come out to their family as gender nonconforming, and come to understand their body dysmorphia and their dissociation and things like that a little bit better. This book is really short, it's easy to read, it's really beautifully written, it's very lyrical, untethered, and kind of unmoored in the way that it writes. It's a little bit stream of consciousness, but it doesn't feel chaotic or disorganized. It is another book that focuses a lot on sex because Dunham uses sex as an indicator of their worth and of their gender. So they talk a lot about how when they are in certain situations, they will pitch their voice higher or lower when they are around certain people or trying to have a sexual relationship with a specific kind of person, how that makes them feel, and how they feel how they're seen by other people. So when people call them they, them, when people call them he, him, when people call them she, her, and kind of the idea of their own self-worth being wrapped up in the sexual desires of their partners and of other people in general. So that part wasn't my favorite, but I think what my favorite part was that Cyrus talks a lot about just like the fears and dread and spiraling thoughts, and does a really amazing job of illustrating that to the reader, and how you can go from being fine to being completely disassociated or in a severe depressive or anxious state just by like thinking about things. Beside from the individual hardship that Cyrus is going through, or that people that they know are going through, there isn't a lot of violence or horrible things that are coming into their life. So luckily we don't have to suffer through scenes of sexual assault or anything like that, but we do suffer with Dunham as they suffer with their depression, with their disassociation, with their dysmorphia, and it is a very hard book to read. There are a lot of passages of eating disorder and disordered eating and restrictive eating. There's a lot of passages of that disassociation. So if those are things that bother you, this could be a really hard book to read. And it was a hard book for me to read, but luckily I don't really deal with a lot of those things personally myself, or not to that huge extent. I definitely have intrusive thoughts like everyone. So it was interesting to read ones that are so devastating, but made so accessible to a person not experiencing that. And I just thought that the writing was beautiful. I thought that the sex was like a little much, but it reminded me a little bit of A History of My Brief Body by Billy Ray Belcourt, in that the sexual passages never felt gratuitous or unnecessary. They were all there as a means to explain the experience that was being had. There's no real resolution to Dunham's life. So this is not a memoir that shows them as a whole and complete person. This is not a memoir that says, this is how I got from point A to point B. It's very, or to this end point, it's very much left as that they are still dealing with their mental instabilities and ailments, as well as their ideas of gender and who they are, what their worth is in their own eyes, as well as society's. I really loved it. I thought it was really great. I'm glad to have picked it up. I would recommend it for anyone interested in these subjects for sure. And those were the first 6 books that I read in April, and when I read some more, I will let you know. It is April 14th, and I finished one more book in April. I finished Peking Story, The Last Days of Old China by David King. I finished this morning. I really liked this short memoir about David Kidd's time in the 1940s living in China. He was living in China as a English teacher, and he had been living there for quite a few years when he met his future wife and ended up marrying her in kind of a rush because her father was dying, and then moving into her family home. It happens to be that his wife was from a once very wealthy aristocratic family high up in politics in old China. So her father had been known in the courts, and they lived in a large compound consisting of many buildings, many gardens, many pavilions, and lived kind of in the lap of luxury. But as her father grew older, his wealth declined. The different regimes that occupied China and the different political movements in China definitely added to that fact. By the time that David Kidd joins the family is actually quite poor, not being able to maintain their large estate. As his father-in-law passes away, they realize even more that they have lost their wealth and that the new Communist Party coming into Peking and coming into China at the time is threatening their lifestyle. This book definitely has a lot of observations from Kidd about his family and their resilience and how they lived in China and how they tried to follow the old Chinese traditions and traditional ways, even though they were obviously a dying breed. It also has a lot to do with the political environment at the time and how communist China was encroaching on the lives of people like this family who were keeping up those traditional ways. It follows 3 or 4 years of Kidd and his wife's family and the progression of them being kind of noble, aristocratic, almost royalty, to their fast decline and then eventual fall into poverty and even imprisonment at the hands of the communist government. Even though this book mostly takes place over 2 or 3 years, there is like a little end part where much later in life, 30 years later, Kidd goes back to have another look at the life that he led and the places that were special to him, and to meet some of his wife's family again, and how so much was different. So many of the family died and so much tragedy befell other people like them in Peking who were punished for holding on to the traditional ideas. I thought the writing was really pretty and nice. It's definitely only a glimpse of what happened, and it's definitely only like remembrances of what happened. It's certainly not the whole story. One thing that I think is very lacking is his relationship with his wife. It's much more about the remembrance of her family and how he and that family meshed, how he observed them, than it is like of their true relationship. I would have liked a little bit more of his relationship with her, because I think that would have described more, or it would have intimated more into his thoughts on the family in some ways. It made me cry at the end. It was so sad for him to go back and see these wonderful places destroyed and this way of life obliterated, and how his family really narrowly escaped like murder and imprisonment and things like that, even though some of his family was imprisoned. It reminded me a lot of Out of Africa. It had a similar tone. The writing is not quite as beautiful in this as it is in that, but that idea of how much he loved and felt comfortable there, how much he had really found his home there, and how much that was destroyed and taken away by this new system of government and, you know, the intolerance towards new people. In Out of Africa, there isn't an intolerance towards new people. Luckily, in many ways, it's the kind of dying of colonialism that requires Karen Blixen to leave her beloved Africa. But the sentiment is very much the same, that these people were very much at home there, even though they were foreigners, and that leaving there left an indelible mark of depression and sadness over the whole rest of their lives. I really love this one. Definitely would recommend this one if you're interested in memoirs, especially if you're interested in that time period. I think it was very interesting reading this after I read It's a Bust last month, which had to do with communist China as well, but several years later in the 1970s, and how it affected the Chinese Americans, or Chinese people living in America at that time. It was an NYRB book, which I love, and it is NYRB April. Make sure to check out my video on my readathon recap for April so that you can see any other NYRB books that fit in with that readathon. And when I read some more, I'll let you know. It is April 24th, and I have finished 2 more books. In April, I finished The Devil and the Dark Water by Stuart Turton. I read this book on audio, and I'm glad that I did, because I definitely don't think I would have finished this book necessarily reading it physically, because it is quite chunky. This book starts out in Batavia, which was what Indonesia was called in the 1600s, 1700s, when the Dutch India Trading Company was carrying spices from that area to Amsterdam. And it follows a spice trader as he is embarking on a return trip to Amsterdam from Batavia. And there are a lot of other things going on the ship as well. He's brought his wife and his child. He's brought his mistress. He has a weird connection to the captain and the passenger coordinator of this ship. Not only is he bringing home his family and his riches, he is bringing home a mysterious object to Amsterdam, which he thinks is going to help in his political and social status once he gets there. And he's also bringing back a prisoner. We soon learn that this prisoner is a great detective, similar to Sherlock Holmes, that he is able to deduce things about people seemingly under supernatural sort of powers. People are always awed by his skills of deduction. Along with this Sherlock Holmes type character, Samuel Pepys is his bodyguard, which we eventually come to find out is the rich spice merchant's nephew. So those are a lot of players. Those aren't all the players. There are guard captains and there are other ship workers that come into play. And there are just so many people that there's even a character manifest or ship manifest in the beginning of the book. And it was extremely helpful, which I will talk about in a little bit. As they are departing from Batavia, Samuel Pepys is being dragged along in chains and his bodyguard is trying to protect him as people are like throwing stones at him, etc., etc. And then if that's not excitement enough, a leper starts talking to the crew and telling them that their ship is doomed, that their mission is doomed, and that the devil rides with them, his master, the devil, rides with them to Amsterdam, and that this ship will never reach its destination. Understandably, a lot of the crew and people who see this are worried, and then when the leper spontaneously combusts and bursts into flames, it is an even more shocking moment. The Spice Master's wife, who has her own pursuits in medicine and medicinal herbs, administers to him, and Samuel Pepys' bodyguard ends up killing him as a kindness to alleviate his pain from the extensive burns. So already the ship is off to like a bad omen, a bad start. We see the Spice Master's wife, Sarah, and Pip's bodyguard, Errant Hayes, kind of coming together to solve the mystery of this leper. And obviously Samuel Pepys is the initial choice to solve this mystery, but because he's in chains and in the smallest of compartments as his jail cell on the ship, he can't get out to explore the ship and ask questions and solve this crime. So Errant Hayes and Sarah are kind of thrust together to solve this mystery. Sarah luckily is a fan of the Samuel Pepys mysteries and the accounts of his amazing feats, so she's a very smart person, so she has no trouble slipping into that role. And Errant Hayes, although he is Samuel Pepys' bodyguard and greatest ally, feels like he's not able to do that, but obviously he has deduction skills of his own. He's learned from Samuel Pepys, and together they have to figure out the mystery of the leper, find out if there really is a devil on this ship, and find out how all these people are connected. So that's the basic premise of the story, and the whole thing takes place on the voyage from Batavia to Amsterdam, and we learn more about each character's background, and we learn more about why these people are all coming together and who this devil might be and what the dark water is and why it might be pursuing them on this ship. I did really enjoy this book. I read it on audio and I really liked the audio narrator. It was one narrator and I think he did a good job at trying to be very distinctive between the very many different characters. But as Nerdy Nat Reads said, it was very handy to have the character list because I didn't always have this on hand when I was reading it because I was reading it on audio, and it definitely would always take me a few minutes to remember who a person was or what their connection to the Spice Merchant was or Errant Hayes was. So it would have been helpful if you were reading this physically to be able to constantly look at this or to have a version of this to like carry around with me while I was reading on audio. I do think that this book was way too long. It's almost 500 pages and I think at least 100 pages could have been cut for this. It's very, very atmospheric and it's very, very slow burn, which is fine, but I think even if you cut 100 pages of it, it still would have been extremely atmospheric and is still extremely slow burn. I think there was not very much repetition for a book this long, but I think enough repetition or enough details that you didn't really need that could have been cut out and made a little bit more concise to make the reading of this book easier. I could see how if you loved this style of writing and if you loved this immersive world that you would become completely immersed in it and that you would enjoy being totally entrenched and ensconced in this style of writing and story itself. But I wasn't ever that much, and I think that the extensive list of characters and seemingly endless connections between them really worked against the story as opposed to for it. There were a lot of interesting things, and I liked kind of finding out in the end how all the connections finally came together, and as we went along, each person and, you know, what happened. And I do think there's some interesting ideas of like warriors and war and how the guard master is seemingly like a very nice person, but he's able to commit atrocious acts. And probably at its heart, this book is about how people can do horrible things for their own gain. And to them, it might initially seem like they are helping themselves or helping others, but obviously they are harming others, and in the end they are going to get their just reward, whether that's from God, the devil, or some other human circumstance. I'm glad I read this book. It was one of the books that I read for a triad chapter, and the chapter was intriguing enough that I wanted to continue. I'm glad that I got a super long book off my shelves. I don't think I would keep this physical copy because I think I would probably always read this on audio, but I am interested to read Stuart Turton's other book, The 7.5 Deaths of Evelyn Hardcastle. That is also a mystery, also long, also I think set on a ship actually. It has a little bit of like a Groundhog Day situation going on, whereas this one was just a straight narrative that was happening. Like I said, I really did enjoy this. I would recommend it if you like, definitely a swashbuckling fantasy, supernatural, mystery, horror, slow thriller. Is slow thriller a genre? It probably should be. The next book, The House of Town by Melissa Ginsberg. This follows our young protagonist, Ava, who has just finished school and is moving in with her grandmother. Only a few weeks ago, her mother suddenly passed away, and she has to move in with a grandmother who she's never met, never known, and who had a very bad relationship with her mother. So Ava is totally a fish out of water. She's leaving Iowa for the first time. She's 14, traveling on her own for the first time, and she's going to New Orleans. When she gets there, her grandmother seemingly doesn't know who she is, doesn't know why she's there, doesn't really understand that Ava's mother, Lane's daughter, has died. And we come to find out that Lane, who is a great artist, never had a good relationship with Ava's mother and has become more and more like mentally obtuse, has secluded herself with only her personal assistant, Oliver, really dove into her work in the last 20 years or so. And the more we find out about Lane, the more we see that her mental ambiguity, her forgetfulness, her mood shifts are probably not only just being an eccentric person, but probably are some form of dementia. So Ava is thrown in with Lane and Oliver and has to kind of figure out their lifestyle, which has a lot to do with drinking and smoking weed and painting and not talking to each other and not communicating. Ava takes the opportunity over the summer to travel around New Orleans on her bike, and she does find out a lot about life. While this book mostly follows Ava, we also see from Lane's perspective, we also see from Oliver's perspective, and we also see from a local council person's perspective who is running for a higher office, whose hidden past somehow connects with Lane. I read this book for the savage prompt of a book set in your favorite city. I'm reading several books based in New Orleans for that prompt, and I was really excited to read this one. I think I heard Mercy's Bookish Musings, Mercedes, talk about this one and was really interested in it. It's quite short. It's set in New Orleans. It has a tumultuous family relationship. So all those things sounded really interesting to me, but unfortunately this book didn't really work for me. I think that it was overly simple and very obvious what was going to happen. 100 to 50 pages to the end, I seriously considered DNFing it because it was going in such an obvious direction that really didn't make sense to me. Ava is a child, and she obviously has led a sequestered and cloistered life, so she is not aware of many things. She gets into trouble. She's going out at night when she shouldn't be. She's talking to teenagers who she shouldn't be talking to. She's exploring an extremely dangerous city in a very casual way, and the adults around her really aren't paying attention to that. But her bad mistakes you can understand because she is this sheltered child. But everyone else's bad mistakes are like ridiculous. Oliver makes extremely stupid mistakes, which he should obviously know better. The council person makes stupid mistakes and does stupid things, and they just don't feel genuine or realistic to how a person with a fair amount of common sense would react or act in these situations. By that 50-page mark, it was so obvious what was going to happen, and of course it did happen, that I really was like, why even bother? Like, if you can telegraph the whole thing from the beginning, like, I did bookmark a couple of aspects that I liked, but there wasn't enough brilliant writing or innovative things or even description of New Orleans that would make this book really, really worth it for me. I am glad that I read it, but overall it just wasn't my favorite. And those were 2 more books that I read in April. It is May, so it's time to finish my April monthly reading wrap-up. The second to last book that I read in April was The Backbone of the World by Stephen Graham Jones. This was a free short story novella on one of my subscriptions, and I was super happy to read another Stephen Graham Jones. If you're going by most people's standards, which is that you have 3 books that you love by one author, generally people do 3 5 stars, but I don't give 5 stars, so I'm going to say 3 books that you love by one author. That author becomes a favorite author. Counting this novella as a book that I loved and as the 3rd book I love by Stephen Graham Jones, I can definitely count him as a favorite author now. The Backbone of the World is about a woman living on reservation land of her family's through marriage. She is a little bit older and she's grieving the loss of her husband, who is not in the picture anymore after having an accident which killed 2 young children. She knows that this wasn't his fault, but she deals with the aftermath of the reservation and the people in town and how they treated him after this accident and the death of the children. And on top of that, his family is now evicting her from the land. So she only has a few more weeks or months to be there. But while she's still there, she decides to rent out the little trailer on the property which she lives to make a little bit of extra money. This story really revolves around her discovering that prairie dogs are starting to encroach on the property. They've always lived kind of just off the property, and there's an extended network of warrens and everything, and it's coming onto the property. So she realizes this, and although her husband was ostracized by the town, the last straw for her would be if his family decided that he didn't do a good job upholding their property. So she goes on a war against these prairie dogs, and as she's doing this, she finds a tenant for her trailer. That tenant seems to have a weird trepidation about the prairie dogs, so weird things are happening with the prairie dogs. She's trying all these different things to get them out, and in the same time, her new tenant is acting very strangely towards them, and so she's trying to kind of understand these 2 things and how they might be connected. This is a very, very short story, like they all are, and I don't want to tell you too much more than that, but it definitely is a horror story, and it definitely has more than meets the eye than just a war on prairie dogs. I really love this story. Stephen Graham Jones has just the most interesting and compelling way of writing and getting you interested and connected with characters so quickly. One of the things that he does really well is letting you feed off of their emotions, so you feel the regret and remorse of our main character over the loss of her husband. You feel her shame at what has happened, but also her need to explain that this was actually a mistake on her husband's part and not something that he intended or not something that would have normally happened. You feel her trepidation of her new tenant, but also while being drawn to the tenant at the same time. So in a very short, only an hour and about 15-minute audiobook, you get all of these emotions and you feel super connected with these characters. And her tenant's character plays even a smaller role in this book, but you also feel a lot of the emotions that that person is feeling. So I loved it, and I definitely highly recommend. This is the first of this particular grouping of short stories that I've read, and I'm interested to read more. There's also one by Jeff Vandermeer, so I'm excited to read that one. The last book that I read in April was Woman Hollering Creek and Other Stories by Sandra Cisneros. I read this for my TBR spin book for April, so you can see a whole vlog on me reading this and my thoughts about that. I will leave that listed down below. This is my second Sandra Cisneros book after reading The House on Mango Street. I liked that book, but it was from a child's perspective, and I was really hoping that this would be very different. And in some ways it was. The beginning of this short story collection does start with young children as the main characters, and that definitely was my least favorite part. But as the book progresses, the ages of our protagonists and of our main characters progress as well. So the first section is young children, the second section is slightly older children, and then the last section is young adults to adults. That was definitely my favorite part and contained most of my favorite short stories. Just like all short story collections, some of these I really enjoyed and some of them I didn't enjoy very much. There were standout stories that make me want to keep reading Sandra Cisneros' work, even though I don't have a love relationship with her writing yet. Some of her writing is so beautiful and descriptive and simple in a very lyrical way, and then some of it is like kind of ugly, and she does a lot of writing as if the main characters are talking to someone, writing a letter to someone, discussing something with someone, but you're only getting one side of the conversation. You're only getting the main character's side of the conversation, which to me can be very jarring. I don't usually like that kind of writing, which to me is totally different from second person perspective where you are the main character, and it's totally different than like epistolary style books where someone is speaking to you or writing a letter to you and you are reading as if you are the person that they are writing to. So there are some styles of stories in here that I really don't jive with, and then there are some that I really did enjoy. So those are all the books that I read in April. It was National Poetry Month this month, and I did read one book of poetry. It was also NYRB April, and I read a couple of those. I ended up reading a book that I did a try a chapter of. I read some books for the Trans Girl April readathon. I read a couple of books set in New Orleans, which you will see a vlog coming out about soon. I read some nonfiction. I read a book of short stories, and then I read a bunch of works on audio as well, 2 short stories and also some longer novels. I read some YA this month, which is weird for me. So it was a really interesting and diverse reading month. I'm glad that I read some books by people of color. I'm glad that I read some Latinx works, and I had a good reading month. I definitely did feel a little slumpy in there, and I ended up reading slightly less books at 11 books than I have in previous months in 2023, but that is okay. It's always amazing to me that like NYRV books end up being some of my favorites all the time. May has already gotten off to quite a bang, so I hope that you had a great reading month in April. I hope that you are having a great reading month in May. Let me know if you've read any of the books that I mentioned here. Let me know what you thought of them. Thanks so much for joining me today, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!